Hello, subscribers! About a week or so ago, a new video popped in my feed from a YouTuber named Hunter Avallone. In this video, he was reacting to another YouTuber that I'm actually subscribed to, named Colin Miller. And unlike the last response I did to a reaction video, this one is actually a reaction video, which maybe Mr. Avallone should reconsider, because he clearly needs more time to think things through before he spouts off his atheist drivel. For anyone not familiar with Colin Miller, he is a discernment channel. He focuses on calling out false teachers in the church, not debating atheists on the existence of God. And from what I've seen, he is very biblical and worth checking out, though it is a rather niche channel. Hunter Avallone, on the other hand, well, let's take a look.
Please help me. Is he about to tell us that it's a sin to wear women's clothing? Or for a woman to wear a man's clothing? Because then he's going to have to admit that it was a sin for women to wear pants, because what is and is not a woman and man's clothing is cultural, and it's socially defined. Okay, so then it's a sin every time a woman wears high heels, right? Because high heels were originally invented for men.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And that's an aspect of gender, since it's social and cultural. A woman shall not wear a man's garment. Okay, what's a man's garment? Could you help me out with that one, please? What's a man's garment? Is it a sin every time me and my wife share a hoodie? Is it a sin? I mean, according to this verse, it's literally a sin for women to wear high heels, because high heels were originally invented for men.
Bruh.
It's also now a sin anytime a woman wears pants. Do you think that's a sin, my dude? He might actually say yes. But the problem is you can't define what a man's garment or a woman's cloak is. You can't define that for me because it's cultural and it's socially based and it's changed throughout the years. You can't make this argument because you can't tell me what is a man's garment. So is it a sin then when women are fighting in the military in uniform? Jesus wore a tunic that was really similar to a dress, bro. Okay, you see, guys, it's only a sin if you wear like a really pretty frilly dress. If you wear like a dark black masculine type dress, you know, more of a cloak, then you're good, okay? So he's literally appealing to culture.
It was at this moment that he knew.
So it's a sin then for women to wear pants.
What?
In the 60s, when women were fighting for the right to wear pants, he would have said that's a sin. That would have been his argument. If it's cultural, it changes. And how the fuck are you arguing now it's a sin for a woman to wear a tuxedo? So what if you got a group of people that all said a woman should wear that? Because if you laid out a pair of pants, people could say, I don't know, it could be for a boy or a girl. Or if you laid out a hoodie, they could say, I don't know, it could be for a boy or a girl. Wait, the guy's dressed like a guy. He's wearing a bow tie, a button-down shirt, and pants and a belt. So now your mannerisms also have to be that of a man? What are the mannerisms of a man? And have those ever changed, pal?
This is the most prevalent fallacy Mr. Avallone makes throughout this video, thinking that because fashion changes, we cannot know the difference between men and women's apparel. But this obviously isn't true, and it's really funny that at the end of that montage I showed, he correctly states that the man is wearing men's clothing, proving that he does know the difference. And I'm gonna need a citation for that claim that high heels were originally made for men. It doesn't change anything if he is actually right about that, because that's not the current culture, so it's completely irrelevant. But I bet the high heels he's thinking of are not the same as the ones pretty much anybody else thinks of when the phrase high heels are mentioned. And when Colin actually brings up the difference in culture, instead of admitting his error and saying something like,
Oh, I guess I jumped the gun there. He did account for the different cultures. My bad, dude.
Mr. Avallone instead just doubles down on his fallacy and ignores the point that was just made.
feminine and masculine, these are culturally defined. Second of all, why is it that it's God's will for men to be masculine? Because a masculine trait right now, according to society and cultural traits and whatnot, is that men need to be strong, tough, and dominant. Why is it? Let's play into his argument for a second. Let's go ahead and say that, sure, that's God's will, that men are masculine. Well, what does it mean to be masculine? Well, according to society and culture, it's being dominant, being controlling, being the boss of the family, the leader of the family. If that's God's will, then how come it's been demonstrated that men who hold traditional masculine values are more likely to abuse women and also accept the abuse of women among peers? Could you help me out with that one, buddy? Why is it that God's will always seems to be leading to more harm on people? It's really strange to me, you know? Why is it that God wants us to do things that have been empirically demonstrated to lead to a net harm on people in relationships and on broader society? Why? They don't have an answer for that because book says so.
Here is a severe lack of critical thinking. In any relationship, there must be a leader. One person must have the final say in matters, otherwise it's just anarchy, and the relationship is doomed to fail. And saying God's will somehow leads to more harm? That's just dumb. I know he's an atheist, so he probably hasn't read the Bible much, but even without ever picking up a Bible, you really shouldn't be that ignorant on what it says. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, and most applicable to this statement, husbands, love your wives. But maybe Mr. Avallone thinks love leads to harm, to which I say, who hurt you? There are plenty of fish in the sea, buddy. You're still young. And he claims masculinity is cultural, but he doesn't provide any evidence of this. Like, when was it ever considered masculine to be weak, fragile, and docile? He doesn't have an answer because social justice says so.
Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. What does it mean to act like a man, bro? At the time, acting like a man included having long hair, wearing high heels, and wearing a fucking tunic, which was really similar to a dress. That was what it meant to act like a man back in biblical times. But now that's changed. So does it mean whatever society has determined is masculine is then the moral thing that you should do? So that's great. That all this means then is that society needs to break down these rigid gender roles that are assigned to articles of clothing, and then it will no longer be a sin. That's the extension of his logic here. If society decides, you know what, hey, pants are unisex, hoodies are unisex, and maybe later on they decide dresses are unisex. Okay, well then that would be a moral thing to wear, right? 140 watching, you're done. Actually, we're going to have 139 watching now because I'm permanently banning you from chat. Bye.
Mr. Avallone can't seem to get his head around the difference between men and women apparel, which is odd because I bet if you showed him a dress with stilettos, he would assume, without any other information to go on, that it was for a woman. And if he saw a tuxedo, he would assume it was for a man. His whole argument boils down to, hypothetically, if Colin had said men shouldn't wear pink, Mr. Avallone would have said,
But you can't define pink, my dude.
just like we don't need to objectively define the color pink to know what the color pink is, we don't need to objectively define the difference between men and women apparel. You know the difference. But he has a solution. Just make all outfits unisex. There are a couple problems with this. First, everyone would have to be wearing muumuus or something similar, because even with outfits today like pants, there is still a difference between men and women pants. Women's pants are constructed very different than men's pants. They have a different shape. So everyone would need an outfit that doesn't need to be a different shape in order for everyone to have the same outfit. But that's a minor point. The second and biggest problem with his argument is that we currently do not live in such a culture. If you want to change the culture, go ahead and try. But that kind of change doesn't happen overnight or without some backlash. And until that change does happen, there are still currently in this culture very obvious differences between male and female clothing. And finally, we get a further peek at his true character as he bans someone for saying, quote, 140 watching, you are done. Like, seriously, that didn't even make sense, but he still felt threatened enough to ban the guy. That is some thin skin, bro.
Yeah, dude, because people can't stop being gay. Guys, this is what it takes to be a Christian now. Literally just deny the existence of genetics. Because gay people, we already know, are set up with a genetic predisposition to being gay. So, how is that a sin, and also how should they resist it? This is talking about is women exchanging natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. What they're talking about here is engaging in hedonism and denying your actual attractions. That's very crucial here, because actually the true context of this verse is more fitting to say it's a sin to not live your life as a homosexual because you are quote-unquote naturally attracted to those people. And there are so many things in nature that are immoral completely. So like raping people is immoral, but we see it in nature all the time. Second of all, if you actually want to go the natural route, why are there over 1,500 animal species that exhibit homosexual behavior? Sounds like it's kind of natural, pal.
There are three major mistakes he makes here. First, he thinks homosexuality is somehow genetic, which doesn't even make logical sense because homosexuals can't reproduce. So you would have to do some real mental gymnastics to argue that the homosexual mutation somehow survived and spread across the whole world. Second, he argues that because of this genetic feature, which he can't prove, that homosexuality must be natural. But in the verse he's arguing against, it says natural relations, not natural attractions. So even if he were right about the genetics, it wouldn't change anything because the homosexual relations or behavior or actions would still be unnatural. Because if evolution were true, the natural action would be to reproduce, and homosexual behavior actively works against that. And third, he misunderstands the word nature. Paul was not an evolutionist. He was not using the word to mean according to our genetics or according to the plants and animals. Natural in this verse would mean the way God intended. And fourth, this is the bonus one, but he actually switches between attraction and behavior without realizing it. I almost didn't catch it myself. But on the one hand, he argues that homosexual attraction is natural because of genetics. And on the other hand, he claims that it's natural because we see the behavior in animals. Something to think about.
What he's advocating for is a type of conversion therapy. He's advocating literally for a religious-based form of conversion therapy. This is something that has been studied for decades and has been repeatedly demonstrated to do absolutely no benefit. I would love to ask this guy if he thinks that he could just make himself not be straight. Do you think if you just prayed really hard, you could just like turn yourself gay? What if you prayed to the devil to just make you gay and you prayed really hard? Do you think you could just overcome your passion for women? No, you couldn't, because your sexuality is an innate and intrinsic part of your being.
Colin is not advocating for conversion therapy. In fact, if you read the comment that Mr. Avallone only glanced at and probably didn't want to read too much of because it would go against his whole narrative, then you would be able to see what is being advocated for. As a person who spent most of his early adult life as a practicing homosexual, I found the word gay to be exceedingly incorrect in describing my sexuality. My mother's middle name was Gay, and that's the name she went by until the word became synonymous with the depraved lifestyle of sexual immorality. Be precise speech. If one is living in a hellbound lifestyle, there's nothing gay about it. By the grace of God, I walked away from that several years ago. To be honest, the attractions are still there and always will be, but the desire to act upon them have vanished entirely. This would not have occurred without the saving blood of Jesus Christ. Put aside sinful desires and focus on following God. If we were to just follow our desires as Mr. Avallone wants, we would all be murderers and thieves. We can certainly pray to be different people, but the vast majority of our desires do not change overnight, especially if it's something that needs to be prayed for. If God were to just instantaneously change our most ingrained desires, that would be very close, if not equivalent, to violating our free will. You might say that if I asked him to change me, then it's not a violation of free will, but think about that. If I ask someone to violate my free will, can they do it? A similar question is, if I ask someone to rape me, can they do it? Now, obviously, if the person in question is quote-unquote raping me within a reasonable expectation of my request, then it is impossible by definition for them to rape me. And our desires are the center of our wills, so changing them changes our wills, and is therefore a violation of our free will by definition. So even though we may ask for it, thereby making it our will to change, God cannot make that change instantaneously without also changing our free will, which, as a rule of thumb, is not something he wants to do. It's funny that he doesn't want to compare homosexuality to a mental illness, but that's exactly what he does, because, let's face it, it is. Even if we were to accept his argument that homosexuality was genetic, it would still be a mental illness. Your desires are a product of your mind. Your sexuality rests in your mind. That makes it a mental problem. If you deny homosexuality as a mental illness, then you have to deny all mental illnesses.
What are the pros of you have these gay attractions and you just deny them for the rest of your life? What are the pros? Are they just you might go to heaven when you die? Are you telling people that they should deny living a happier and fulfilling life because of the off chance that we have a soul that will go up in the clouds to paradise or something? Because that doesn't sound like a really great deal.
Fulfilling your sexual desires will not make you happy, especially sinful desires. Now, there are plenty of examples of people who were not happy living in that sin and found happiness getting out of it, including that one comment we looked at that Mr. Avallone ignored. But I don't have the time or inclination to go looking at statistics in order to make a more robust argument. Instead, I'll just move on to something else he said. It is not some off chance that you go to heaven. That is such a ridiculous straw man. Colin at no point made some Pascal wager argument that you have better chances of going to heaven if you just don't sin in this one area. His video was made for Christians, whether real or at least professing. It was not made for some high school atheist streamer looking for content.
Now, I don't think being gay is a sin at all because it's not, but for the sake of argument, isn't it true that certain sins can actually destroy a marriage as well? Like, if they're both gay, is that sin heavy enough to break apart the marriage? Probably not, actually. This guy would probably say that even if, like, the husband is beating the wife every day and raping her every night, that's just, that's just God's will, because they got married, no divorce is allowed. Please explain why it's sinful. Or is it literally this easy? It's just a sin because old book says so? I don't know. For me, I consider myself a very, critical thinker.
You serious?
And for me, just defining my moral because book says isn't good enough. That doesn't fly for me, If I say, hey, being gay is bad, why? Well, book says so. Well, okay, why don't we start our own religion? And we have a thing that says being gay is good. Now my religion says being gay is good. And my book says so. It's circular. It makes no sense. And it's just God says so because the Bible says so because Bible, because God. And you never actually connect the dots. Why is it bad to be gay? You need to tell me why it's bad and what harm it does. How anger and lying actually does a harm, right? So if you are angry a lot, that does a harm to relationships around you. That even negatively affects your mental well-being. Lying all the time breaks down the trust people have in you, and this actually harms you and harms your ability to function in society. Living your life as a gay person doesn't.
AIDS. AIDS is a harmful effect of homosexuality. There are, of course, other harms, like going to hell. But I'm not a sociologist, and it really doesn't matter because sin is not based on whether or not harm is done, unless you count harm done to God, and I shouldn't even need to explain why it's a sin. The fact that God says it's a sin should be good enough to accept that it is a sin. Again, he is reacting to a Christian. Talking to other Christians, no proving of God is necessary. There is no circular reasoning going on. And what was his reason that homosexuality isn't a sin?
Now, I don't think being gay is a sin at all because it's not.
Just because. Literally, his whole reason to conclude it isn't a sin is just because. Of course, he has to have such a weak reason, because on his worldview, there can be no such thing as sin. Homosexuality is not a sin, murder is not a sin, pedophilia is not a sin, and so on and so forth. For something to be a sin, you need God. You need a standard for which we can miss the mark. And no such standard exists on atheism.
Can you explain why it's a wicked sin? I would just love to talk to any of these people about why. Why is it a sin? What makes it a sin?
Sure, I'll tell you. Leviticus 18, verse 22 through 23. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. Neither shalt thou lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Neither shall any woman stand before beasts to lie down thereto. It is confusion. Other translations say perversion instead of confusion, and I think that's a better translation. It is a perversion of God's design. Since you love your catchphrases so much, I'll give you one you should already be familiar with. God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Complain all you want about this phrase being too simple or whatever, but it is the simplest and quickest way to explain why homosexuality is a sin. Homosexuality is a sin, and you have no ground to say it's not. You are an atheist. So in your worldview, there can be no such thing as sin. Sin is an incoherent concept on atheism.
You'll notice too that these people get really, really mad whenever there's any kind of advocacy to accept people who are gay or lesbian or whatever into the church, which is really strange also because even that directly contradicts what Jesus advocated for. Jesus wanted everybody to come to the church. That's why he said the thing about you don't send a doctor to a sick, or you don't send a doctor to a healthy person. You send a doctor to a sick person. Now, of course, I don't think gay people are sick. It's actually people like this guy who are sick because they've been brainwashed by Sky Daddy. But all things considered, this is closer to a biblical concept than what you're advocating for, which is exclude gay people, and if they dare enter our church, they might give us cooties, so we need to pray the gay away. Actually gave a good impression of Christians for once, but no, he's here to ruin it. There was no word for homosexuality, and if you look at the original context in the original Greek and Hebrew, it wasn't actually referring to a loving, consensual gay marriage. If you want to talk about that, we can. By the way, the traditional Christian doctrine of marriage is between one man, one woman, and God. That's really crucial, and people like this will always leave that out, because then they'd have to bite the bullet that it's a sin for atheists to get married. Second of all, marriage is no longer a religious institution. Nowadays, marriage is a state institution. And so the state cannot discriminate on the basis of religion. That is a direct violation of the First Amendment, because Congress shall uphold no religion. So if they deny rights to one person, or deny the right to get married and receive the same type of government benefits for that marriage to people on the basis of the fact that they're gay, they are violating the Constitution. We get this, I don't hate gay people, ooh woo. It's a free country, haha. You can live your life however you want, LOL. But if you do, then you will burn in hell for all of eternity. The devil will rape you every night and a worm will crawl inside of your anus. All tomboys have violated God's divine word and are now doomed to eternal flames. Tomboys out there, I will be praying for you. You know, maybe they should just split up and go, like, maybe she should just go marry another woman and the dude should just go marry another man, you know? Then maybe they wouldn't be resisting their natural attractions, like Romans said. I actually say it's a little weird if you're married but also have these other attractions, but notice that this is a result of Christianity. This is a result that you have to be married to a man and a man has to be married to a woman. that now you have people that are following God's biblical rules, but they also still have attractions to the opposite sex because they're gay and because they're lesbian. And it's almost like there's a genetic reason for that. Bruh, Jesus is rolling in his grave. You argue against Christianity when you aren't even Christian? Why do you argue against liberalism if you're not a liberal? Why do you argue against conservatism if you're not a conservative? Why do you argue against crime if you're not a criminal? That's a very dumb argument, my friend.
Now, given the way that question was worded in that last part, I actually agree with Mr. Avallone that it was a dumb argument, but only because of how it was worded. The point that the question was trying for was that Mr. Avallone is butting into an in-house debate. Colin Miller is a Christian making videos for Christians specifically with the intent of pointing out false teachers. Mr. Avallone, as we saw in this clip, does not have the biblical knowledge to get in on this debate. Let's go over some examples. First, he doesn't understand the church's position on sin in the church. 1 Corinthians 5:11 through 13. But now I have written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, with such an one know not to eat. For what have I to do to judge them also that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within, but them that are without God judgeth. Therefore, put away from among yourselves that wicked person. Actually, the whole chapter would be best, but I don't want to spend more time on this than is necessary. Next, he says the word homosexual isn't in the Bible, in the original language, which is a really dumb argument, for what I hope is obvious reasons. But then he basically contradicts himself by saying the original context wasn't referring to a loving consensual marriage, but the context of what? You just said it doesn't use the word homosexual, and now you're trying to appeal to context of this word that isn't there? Everybody knows, even illiterate atheists know, that the Bible clearly defines homosexual behavior as a sin. And let's quickly move to the third point because it overlaps. But he tries to define marriage as between man, woman, and God, which is complete cowpie, and easily refuted by Matthew 19:4 through 5. And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Nowhere in those verses, or anywhere in the Bible, does it say that God shall also be twain and be one flesh with the man and woman. Then he tries to argue that marriage is a state institution. Really stretching those brain cells, isn't he? Marriage existed before the state. Even if you don't think that God instituted it, it was still around long before the Constitution, and was always a religious ceremony. The state doesn't get to claim it for itself. It's actually one of those things that the state needs to get out of, because it's a religious institution. Fourth, he does a really dumb caricature of Christians, followed by a complete misrepresentation of hell. He seems to get his hell doctrine from Tenacious D. Satan will not rape you in hell. Satan is a prisoner like everyone else, and even then, he will be in the lake of fire separate from any human. Continuing on his misrepresentation of hell, he also misunderstands basic salvation doctrine, which can be corrected by looking at John 3:18. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Next, he tries to claim that Romans supports his view based on his own misconception that homosexuality is genetic, and thus homosexuality is somehow natural, which was not how Paul viewed the matter at all. And finally, probably the single dumbest thing he says in his whole video. He says Jesus is rolling in his grave, his empty grave. The very event on which all of Christianity is founded. Jesus is not in his grave. I don't care if you don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. That is a dumb statement. To think that Jesus would care about any of this if he wasn't who he said he was? If Jesus was actually in his grave right now, then he would not care about any of this one way or the other. So this next part is probably the best example of his inability to think critically.
The Bible says that Jesus experienced all the temptations that humans experience as well. All of them. That's in the Bible. So by extending that logic, that means even Jesus had gay attractions at a time, or bisexual attractions, or just general sexual attractions. So that's another thing that these Christians never want to talk about.
You cannot go from Jesus was tempted in all points to Jesus was tempted with homosexuality. It just doesn't follow. And it's real easy to show why it doesn't follow. Was Jesus tempted to hack someone else's computer? Was he tempted to make a prank call? Was he tempted to jaywalk or run a red light? Obviously not, because those sins didn't exist yet. Jesus was tempted in the foundational sins, which all other sins can be applied to or stem from. So I made a little illustration to make this more clear. Here we have a more foundational sin of dishonesty, and that will be the branch. And then the limbs that stem off of that, prank calls, perjury, white lies, they're all just types of the sin that they are branching off of. Much in the same way that Reubens, Monte Crisco's, and hamburgers are all types of sandwiches, prank calls, perjury, white lies, all types of dishonesty. And even dishonesty itself might just be a branch of a deeper sin. But without going into that, I'll just say Jesus was tempted with dishonesty. And therefore, he wasn't specifically tempted with prank calls or perjury or white lies, but they're covered in the dishonesty. And really, dishonesty is probably covered in something deeper, but this video is going on too long. I don't have time to try and flesh all that out. But let's go to the one. We got sexual immorality as the base, with fornication, homosexuality, bestiality. You can be tempted with sexual immorality without being tempted specifically with these. Also, adultery would be on here. I forgot to write that one. But you get the idea. You can be tempted in all sins without being tempted in every specific sin, especially since every specific sin doesn't always exist at the same time. The more foundational sins stay the same always, but there are always subtypes of sins that can change with the times. Okay, last clip, I promise.
Video, you will receive a dislike from me and also a comment. This video had several flaws. Would you like to chat on my channel at some point? Hopefully, we can talk. May God be with you. Comment. All right.
This is the smartest thing he does, but it is a weak attempt at best. There are over 1,200 comments on that video, and Colin posts pretty regularly, so I don't expect him to actually respond to it. And in fact, I've checked, and he hasn't so far. Nor should he respond. His video was not made for atheists looking for content. It was made for Christians seeking truth. If he spent a little time actually thinking critically about the subject, maybe he could have answered most of his questions before needing to ask them. Or he could have even just read the very comments on the video, including the comment pinned by Colin himself. Note, if you disagree with me that her outfit is cross-dressing, remember that her husband actively encourages her as she consistently shops in the Target boys section for clothes. He also said that they don't have to make any attempt to change their attire for one another. We can agree or disagree about that specific outfit, but the accusation of cross-dressing has a significant amount of evidence here. I stand by it. and I stand with Colin. So, as we've seen, the four main persisting problems in Mr. Avallone's arguments are: 1. He consistently appeals to the changing culture as an excuse for people to be transvestites, and even when this point is thrown back at him as fallacious, he doubles down and ignores the problem. 2nd, he appeals to genetics and equivocation to try and show that it's natural to be gay, without any evidence that his definition of natural is the same as Paul's, or that genetics has anything to do with homosexual attraction. 3rd, speaking of attraction, he completely misses the difference between attraction and behavior, even when that difference was pointed out in the very comment section he was in. And finally, all of this was undergirded by a complete misreading or misunderstanding or just complete denial of scripture. Also, before I leave, I just want to point out the hypocrisy of him trying to claim some sort of moral high ground when his shirt says men are all scum. Like, you realize the gay men you're trying to defend as not sinning, you are simultaneously calling scum.
They're not sick or sinning, and they don't have a mental illness. Oh, but they are totally scum.
Links to both videos will be in the description. I do recommend watching Colin's video since I didn't show any of it here, and I recommend ignoring Mr. Avallone's video as it's just hateful garbage, and his chat, which was on screen, was even worse. Just a cesspool of anti-Christian bigots. See you next time.